listeners, and welcome to the NKNews Podcast. I'm your host, Jacco Zwetsloot, and today it is Monday, the 20th of June, 2022, and I'm joined here via Zoom by senior Swedish diplomat, Ambassador Jakob Hallgren. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you all, please leave a review about this podcast wherever you can. Spotify allows ratings but not reviews. Apple Podcast allows both, and you can like and subscribe to our feed on YouTube. And if you enjoy this episode, please share it with people. Secondly, check out nknews.org and consider buying a subscription. Thirdly, you can follow nknews.org on Twitter or myself at Jacco Z, J-A-C-C-O-Z-E-D on Twitter. For podcast suggestions and feedback, you can tweet at us or email us at podcast@nknews.org. Okay, so to introduce my guest today more properly, my guest, Ambassador Jakob Hallgren, is currently the director of the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, or UI. But before that, he was ambassador for disarmament and non-proliferation and the ambassador of Sweden to South Korea, as well as the deputy director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, also known as SIPRI. You can find him on Twitter at Hallgren Jakob, and we'll put the link there in the show notes. Welcome on the show, Jakob. Great to have you on.
Thank you very much, Jacco, for the invitation.
Have you ever been to North Korea?
Actually, I have not, so I cannot boast about that. I have met quite a few North Koreans, but I have not been to the country.
Now, you were Sweden's ambassador to South Korea during a very interesting time with summits and meetings between the two Koreas and between North Korea and the United States. How do you look back on that time?
Well, first of all, I realize I must justify or kind of develop or become a little bit more precise regarding my response before. I have indeed been 2 steps into North Korea at DMZ and in Pyongyang a couple of times. But yes, how do I look back on that time in 2018 and onwards? Well, I arrived in Seoul in the summer of 2018. It was a time full of hope, and many were very optimistic and hopeful about the prospects of a rapprochement and of that something quite drastic would happen in a positive sense between the two countries. But then, of course, looking back at that time and how that hope has progressively waned into something which is today quite different. Yeah, it might have been naive, but yeah, maybe there could have been some chances if some things would have turned out differently, that we would have been in a more positive place today, but difficult to say.
And then when did you leave South Korea and go back to Sweden?
I left in August last year, 2021.
Okay, so that period of hopefulness had definitely already finished, hadn't it?
Yes.
And then you moved to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, where you were the deputy director. Tell us a little bit to our audience who may not know, what is SIPRI and what was your role there?
Well, I was at SIPRI before coming to Seoul, and then I moved to the Stockholm International Institute of International Affairs, also called UI in Swedish. So at SIPRI, before I went to Korea, I was the deputy director, and now I am the director. And actually, both institutes have activities and research and analysis related to Korea. At SIPRI, where I was for 6 years between 2012 and 2018, I oversaw and closely collaborated with actually both South Koreans and South Korean institutions and North Koreans and North Korean institutions to some extent. And at the International Institute of International Affairs here in Stockholm, where I am now, we also have a program focusing on Northeast Asia and specifically some research projects on North Korea, and more specifically the relation between Sweden and North Korea. And when I was at SIPRI, we had regular visits and meetings, both research fellows from South Korea and visitors from North Korea, and some quite interesting meetings with North Koreans who regularly came to Stockholm. And this has, of course, not been the case since last summer due to restrictions in traveling and so on. So we haven't had a chance to interact with North Koreans since I arrived at UI, or the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, where I am right now. But I hope that will change in the future.
Certainly, yeah. That's a lot of things have been still and quiet since the beginning of the COVID era. I saw in a very recent news report that SIPRI, where you were before, gave estimates for this year for the number of actual assembled nuclear warheads that North Korea possesses, and it gave the maximum number of 20. Did you see that report as well?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
And, do you have any comment on that?
Well, the only thing that I can say is that it is, of course, extremely difficult to know exactly how many warheads or bombs that they have. There might be assessments in the undisclosed intelligence world. But having been at SIPRI for many years, I know that SIPRI works exclusively with open sources and triangulating what various analysts and experts say. I don't think that is an unrealistic number, but at the end of the day, it is difficult to say exactly how many they have.
Right.
And then that is, of course, to be separated from the delivery, vehicles. And it's one thing to have the bomb; it's another one to be able to launch it. And we've of course all seen all of the missile launches, both cruise missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles. And I think the jury is still out whether they have been able to render those nuclear weapons or devices sufficiently small to be put into those missiles, even though the signs are maybe ominous. It's still a long way to go to have an operational force that is really operational in a reliable sense from a military perspective.
Now, the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, or UI, how does that differ from SIPRI? Is there much overlap?
SIPRI is a foundation whose focus is very much focusing on the whole world outside Sweden, research and analysis, and they have their world-class databases, etc., military spending, and so on. UI, or Swedish Institute of International Affairs, have essentially three mandates. They're partly overlapping, partly different. We also do research on international affairs. We do a lot of policy analysis, but then we also have a mandate to do public outreach and public education in Sweden in Swedish. We were founded already in 1938 at the time, not entirely unlike today, where it was realized that there was a huge need to understand what was happening around the world. So we do a lot of seminars and outreach and publications in Swedish, but we're also doing increasingly a lot of work in analysis and research in English as well. So partly similar and partly different, and kind of adding up to this interesting landscape of think tanks, research institutes that we have in Stockholm.
Well, that's right. I mean, there's also one which I was just made aware of recently. That's the Institute for Security and Development Policy, ISDP, which has a specific research center for inter-Korean affairs called the Stockholm Korea Center. I know that's not where you work, but can you tell us anything about it and how it relates to UI and SIPRI?
No, I think that is exactly what I meant when I said that Stockholm is becoming quite an interesting place for any Korea watcher. We, of course, have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well, and the Swedish engagement in the Korean Peninsula, which we will talk about later. ISDP is focusing on Central Asia, Northeast Asia, China, to some extent, I believe, also Southeast Asia. So they're very geographically, thematically focused on those areas. And they do very good things, which I'd say complement and adds to to the picture of interesting work from many angles, because as we know, there's no shortage of angles regarding events and developments in Northeast Asia. So I'd say we are complementing each other fairly well.
And what makes Stockholm so special? Why is there this unique landscape of interesting think tanks and institutes looking at foreign affairs and in particular in Korea?
I guess it's a result of a long tradition of international and global engagement from successive Swedish governments, the many years of neutrality and non-alignment, but most importantly, I would say a real wish and will by successive Swedish governments to invest in mediation, facilitation. In this good Nordic tradition, we see similar patterns in Norway and in Finland as well. But regarding Northeast Asia and North Korea, the fact that Sweden was the first Western country to open diplomatic relations already in the 70s with North Korea and other things related to that have of course added to the interest, I would say, also from the North Korean side in Sweden and Stockholm as an interesting meeting place, etc. So that of course means that it's an interesting place for North Korea and Northeast Asia watchers to be, because interesting people come through Stockholm.
Yes, you mentioned that diplomatic relations were first normalized in the 1970s. So tell us a little bit about diplomatic relations between Sweden and North Korea, and how they came to be normalized and set up embassies in each other's countries.
Yeah. This was a political decision in the early 70s. There was a thaw in 1972 between the North and the South, and Sweden was fiercely neutral at the time. So there was partly that wish to balance relations with the West and the East, as it were. And there were partly maybe also a somewhat naive belief that there would be economic opportunities, because as part of that neutrality policy at the time, trade-wise and commercial outreach was made equally much to the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, as to the West, where of course the majority of all the trade and business was done. So for those reasons, it was decided that Sweden would seek opening of diplomatic relations, which was apparently accepted on the North Korean side. So they were established in 1973, and then that was followed by the opening of the embassy in Pyongyang in 1975. And then, of course, this builds on quite a strong engagement and commitment to the Korean Peninsula, which started already during the Korean War, when Sweden sent this quite impressive field hospital to Bhutan, which served for more than 7 years, and then led to helping South Korea's public health to grow. And the field hospital was caring for more than 2 million patients over those years. And then the end of the war, when the armistice was signed, Sweden was, of course, chosen to be one of the two members of the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission on the southern side, together with Switzerland, and then Poland and Czechoslovakia were, of course, there on the northern side. So there was already a tradition of engagement with both the South and the North, because, mind you, the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission in the first year, much of what they did was to oversee the repatriation of refugees and war prisoners of war, etc., even though they were only operating on the southern side. There was kind of a knowledge and a tradition of sending Swedish officers for many years to Panmunjom in the 70s when this was decided. And then after the opening of the embassy in 1975, I think the next key development was in 1995 when Sweden became the protective power of the United States and progressively also the Australia, Canada, and the Nordic countries for consular affairs.
Could you tell a little bit about what that means? Because not everybody will be familiar with this concept of protective power.
Well, it sounds, of course, a little bit funny to say that Sweden would be a protective power of the United States. But
yes.
it does only pertain to consular affairs. So in this case, the United States does not have a diplomatic relations and do not have a diplomatic representation in Pyongyang. But this does, of course, not prevent American citizens from traveling to the country, or hasn't, even though it has been limited. It has happened over the years.
Right.
So when they end up in trouble of some kind, they need to be protected or taken care of somehow, because the United States has a responsibility for their citizens. And in those cases, there's then an agreement with Sweden, who has an embassy in the country, to send its diplomats to ask for meetings with the persons who might end up in trouble of some kind. That could, of course, be anything from prison to illness, in the worst case, death. And since that is part of the diplomatic relations between countries who have diplomatic relations, that you are allowed to take care of your citizens or those you are responsible for. That is essentially what is happening. And there's been a couple of high-profile cases over the years, as you know, where Sweden has been able to assist in one way or another, but of course always ultimately depending on the goodwill of the host country.
Yeah, that's right. Now, so you've told us a little bit about Sweden in the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission and Sweden as a protective power. Sweden, with its embassy, opened in Pyongyang in 1975. Does North Korea have an embassy in Stockholm?
Yes, they do. And that I guess, also adds to this strength, relative strength of the bilateral relation. And that is the only embassy among the Nordic countries. There's another embassy in Berlin, and I think in Prague as well. Another. So this is the only one in the Nordic countries. Yeah.
And do you remember which year that opened up?
I do not remember offhand, but I'm quite sure it must have been a part of that reciprocal opening of diplomatic relations. I check it out, but I'm quite sure it must have been in the mid-70s as well.
Okay. All right. Yes. So a very similar time period. Yeah. Now, what does Sweden do to help bring together the two Koreas in either bilateral or multilateral forums?
Well, first of all, Sweden is, of course, not a mediator, but more, I'd say, rather a facilitator. And I think that the most recent push and strengthened commitment started in 2017, when the relations between North Korea and the United States were at a historical low. The exchange of invectives and quite worrying war of words that happened at the time between the then President Trump in the United States and the North Korean President Kim Jongun was at a level which I think worried a lot of people, including, of course, the nuclear test in September 2017 and the ICBM launch in November 2017. All of that added to a situation where Stockholm and Sweden realized that, okay, we have relations between those two countries. We have a possibility to talk to the North Koreans through various channels. Is there anything that little Sweden could do to somehow contribute to promoting peaceful outcomes? So at the time then, apart from all the things I mentioned about the three missions on the peninsula, in Pyongyang, in Panmunjom, and in Seoul, and the long commitment to both countries, a special envoy was appointed, Ambassador Kent Herstedt. So he started to travel to reinvigorate, to further cultivate the personal contacts that we had both in Pyongyang, in the United States, and in essentially all of the other countries in the six-party format, to see where there may be misunderstandings that could be straightened out, or where there in other ways could we kind of send messages? Could we somehow provide any assistance that could add to a de-escalation of the situation at that time. And I don't think Sweden should in any way take any credit for the peace diplomacy and Olympic diplomacy that happened in February 2018, which we spoke about earlier. The hopeful, but maybe in the fringes, in the margins, it was helpful that someone was, how should I put it, acceptable to talk to both sides, and that could add a little bit to the de-escalation, along with many other factors.
Yes. So certainly Sweden was important in facilitating a meeting place or a safe space for the United States and North Korea to talk. Was there a precedent for this? I mean, had Sweden played host to non-public dialogues between the US and DPRK before 2017?
Oh, yeah, no, but there had been many meetings under the radar, so-called track 1.5 or track 2 format, which had preceded that. But what happened in 2019, in January, just before Hanoi, and then later on in October in 2019, that was more track 1 official meetings. But before that, several meetings had happened more, with former officials or officials who came in a capacity as academics, or the famous track 1.5 or track 2 type of meetings where officials and representatives can talk more openly, maybe, even though on the North Korean side, it's rare to meet people who speak openly. They, of course, have to follow a very tight script. But the fact that they came was important, including, for instance, the current newly appointed foreign minister, Madam Chosen. He came to Stockholm and to the other Nordic countries several times in those years.
Yes, as I recall, the last substantive meeting between the US and DPRK, certainly in track 1, was the one you just mentioned in October 2019 between Steve Biegun and North Korea's chief nuclear negotiator at that time, Kim Jongun, in Stockholm. Now, that meeting didn't end well, and that was the end of the direct negotiations until 1. Are you able to give any insight on why it went so badly?
I think I wasn't there, so I can't give any direct first-hand insight, but I think it needs to be seen in the context of what happened in 2019, where Hanoi broke down, and if you might recall, North Korea gave some kind of a deadline until the end of the year 2019. Otherwise, there would be a Christmas gift, Christmas present, and there were also, after Hanoi, one more direct meeting between Kim Jongun and President Trump, and how North Korea described it as if relations with the US were bad, but relations with President Trump were still good. And I think it was reflective of a wish to possibly see if something in this dialogue could still be saved. But from what I understand from the readouts and from the discussions with the people who were there in October 2019, the North Korean delegation might have come already to the meeting with like a 95% clear instruction saying that they would make the negotiations break down, but maybe also with a 5% benefit of the doubt if the American side would bring things to the table related to the wishes from the North Korean side. If you remember from Hanoi, they were talking about 4 or 5 crucial sanctions which would be lifted. Then they would maybe have allowed that dialogue to continue. But as I remember, the American side wanted to, saw this as a longer process of starting a dialogue where it was difficult to agree on such crucial concessions without the necessary concessions from the North Korean side, and so it might be that the decisions was already made on the North Korean side to give the American side a snub. I don't know, but the chances were anyway not very high before that meeting that it would lead forward. Even though it was, of course, interesting that they came all the way to Stockholm, they wanted to meet. So difficult to say, but the chances weren't very high anyway after Hanoi, which
Yes.
if you recall, it was kind of described as seen in North Korea as a humiliation, etc. And on the other hand, on the American side, it was difficult to agree to the to the North Korean demands. So maybe they were simply too far apart.
The Institute for International Affairs, which you're now the director of, 2.5 years ago, issued a brief in February 2020 called Korean Unification, Can the Dream Be Realized? Are you familiar with this brief?
Sure, yes.
Could you summarize its conclusion for us? Can the dream be realized?
Well, essentially, the response is no, or at least extremely unlikely, unfortunately. This is what some colleagues wrote at the time, where they essentially, listing the challenges to a reunification, where they are looking at economic costs, the international sanctions, U.S. and Chinese wariness to allow a unified Korea, given the wider geopolitical and geostrategic location of the peninsula, but I think most importantly, what they at the time assessed and lowering interest in South Korean population to carry this burden, which I guess would be quite high economically, etc., in terms of an integration. And that is, of course, besides the question of under what terms such a reunification should happen. So I think it's absolutely right from a Korean perspective to keep that vision and dream alive, because you never know. History keeps surprising us.
Yeah.
But if you look at it coldly, analytically, a couple of quite magnificent obstacles and thorny issues, which would need to be taken care of. So I guess that the colleagues at the time came to that conclusion, and I guess personally, given my own experience, I would tend to agree. Even though, as I said, we should, of course, as a diplomat, which I used to be, should always try to stay optimistic and try to see opportunities, and all of a sudden things might happen which are also positive, not only negative. But right now, with the current events globally and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, etc., the pessimists have the upper hand, and the realists, etc.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Yeah, Vladimir Putin's decision to launch a war on Ukraine has certainly changed many things in the global order, as you mentioned. What do you believe it has changed for North Korea?
Well, I think that for North Korea, it means that they have a stronger ally in Russia, even stronger, and which might even help them to balance out the otherwise quite huge dependence on China. I mean, they were one of 5 countries only who voted, no against the General Assembly as resolution condemning the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine, and they have sent or made a public announcement supporting Russia in different ways. And if now Russia is becoming increasingly internationally isolated, at least from the whole West and OECD area, they are in some ways joining a club where North Korea has been for a long time, and I don't know what this will mean for Russian willingness to abide to the sanctions regime against North Korea, etc. They voted against a draft resolution in the Security Council a couple of weeks ago after some of the recent North Korean missile launches, etc. So I think it brings North Korea closer to Russia, and that is, I guess, from a North Korean perspective, positive.
But looking at Russia's mixed success in its Ukraine invasion, do you have any thoughts on whether this might embolden Kim Jong-un to take some adventurous risks, or whether it might make him less likely to do anything rash?
Well, I guess I don't know if North Korea ever has had, or at least not for a long time, have had, offensive military intentions. That is, launching an attack on South Korea. Certainly it was like that in the history, but it seems to me that in the last decades and the nuclear weapons programs, I think, is an illustration of that, is to have a very dissuasive defensive force. And then they are, of course, whipping up the risk that South or the United States would attack. So if they were ever in the last decades nurturing an idea of invading the South, I think that has probably waned even further since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But it's difficult to say. From the Russian invasion of Ukraine is still, and that war is still ongoing, and it has turned from an attempt to, quickly conquer the country to some kind of very primitive and extremely brutal warfare using a lot of old conventional weapons, fighting meter for a meter. Yeah, I don't think North Korea assesses that they would have the resources to engage in something like that, unless, of course, they got full support from China and Russia. I don't know if that is in anyone's interest right now.
Yeah. Now, Sweden's recent decision to join NATO is a related matter in that it is also caused or accelerated by the war on Ukraine, but separate to the North Korean situation. However, it does raise interesting questions about Sweden's neutrality, Sweden's continuing role in the NNSC, and Sweden as a neutral middle ground or facilitator between the DPRK and the US. So I was wondering what your thoughts are, and what does it mean that Sweden has applied to join NATO, ending its historic neutrality?
Well, first of all, the neutrality was ended already in the 1990s when Sweden joined the European Union. So since then, Sweden has been militarily non-aligned, but with a very close collaboration with NATO. But it is true that the application to join NATO is ending that era of first neutrality and then military non-alignment. Yeah, it will remains to be seen how the parties will react to this change of Swedish security policy. There are many examples of NATO countries like Norway and etc. and other France, whatever, Turkey, who've been successful negotiators in different conflicts around the world. And as I alluded to in the beginning of this conversation, it has partly to do with the country's security policy identity, but it has a lot to do also with the willingness and the wish to engage and put resources behind facilitation and mediation, etc. And when it comes to the Korean Peninsula and Sweden's engagement, Sweden was, of course, not a warring party in the Korean War with this field hospital, which cared both for South Korean, of course, first of all, the combatants in the alliance, American and all of the 16 countries who were fighting, but then also South Korean civilians and actually quite a few North Korean combatants, prisoners of war, etc. Yeah. So there is like this humanitarian legacy, and then this role to serve as one of the four countries in the NNSC since 1953. So I guess it remains to be seen how that is assessed from all sides.
So North Korea, I mean, the embassy in Stockholm hasn't made an official comment on this yet, then?
No, not as far as I know. No.
Oh. Okay, and if I understand correctly, it won't affect Sweden's role in the NNSC, but North Korea has, over the years, found reasons to expel other members from the NNSC, Poland for one reason and Czechoslovakia for no longer being a country. So they threw out both the Czechs and the Slovaks. Could they use this as an excuse to ignore Sweden?
Well, first of all, it must be remembered that those countries, Czechoslovakia, which split up to become two countries, and then Poland, they were countries chosen by the North, Chinese so-called voluntary forces, and North Korea at the time as members of the NNSC, whereas Switzerland and Sweden were chosen by the southern side, the United States and the UN command, etc. So it's not North Korea's decision to whether Sweden and Switzerland should remain as member of NNSC. Yeah? That's more on the southern side. But I do see now that North Korea has indeed made that they have denounced Sweden and Finland for expected applications. Whether that will, this is on YONAP, and whether that will have a bearing on the NNSC remains to be seen. But so far, I'm not aware of that.
And outside the NNSC, do you think that North Korea will continue to respect Sweden's role as an honest broker between the various parties, or is there a danger that Sweden might lose its prominence to fellow neutral small state Switzerland?
Difficult to say. We haven't seen any clear indications of that as of yet. Switzerland is magnificently well placed to do a lot of mediation and facilitation, a prominent place. But so is, for instance, Norway, which has been a NATO country since the 1940s. So this is kind of adding to my point that it is. There are several factors that determines whether conflicting parties would accept an outsider as facilitator or honest broker, and so difficult to say. But no, so far we're not aware of that there has been a change.
Final question here: do you have any hopes for future improvement during your time there at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs?
Well, I always retain the hope, and I, as I said, history keeps surprising us.
Yes.
So, there is no shortage of will or wish in South Korea, and I believe also in North Korea, to find a way forward to make sure that families can be reunited and that all Koreans sharing history, culture, food, and norms in so many ways could be reunited again. But unfortunately, there's a lot of challenges which are intra-Korean and also external to the Korean Peninsula, which makes this, of course, if you look at it realistically, not a particularly realistic possibility in the near term or in the close. In the next few years, but then again, you never know. All of a sudden, parameters and conditions could change. But
is there a possibility that you might be at some stage named as a special emissary or ambassador to North Korea?
We have an eminent and excellent ambassador doing that since several years with a lot of networks and knowledge in Kent Herstedt, and he's doing a great job. I just started a new job, so I don't think is a very realistic option right now. And Kent is really doing fantastic, and I hope he will continue for a long time doing what he's so good at.
Excellent. Okay. Well, we wish you good luck there in your new job at UI.
Thanks a lot, Jacco, and great to talk to you today.
Thank you for coming back on the show, Jakob Hallgren. You can follow Jakob on Twitter at Hallgren Jakob. We'll put the link in the show notes. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of today's podcast. If you already have an NK News subscription, you can check out our NK Pro platform, which offers unparalleled services, specifically catering to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula. You can inquire about access at membership@nknews.org today, and also ask for a free trial membership. Also, if you have any feedback, questions, or guest recommendations, please send them to podcast@nknews.org. Our thanks, as always, go to Arius Dare and Brian Betts for facilitating this podcast, and to Gabby Magnuson, our post-recording producer genius. Thanks, and listen again next time.